Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lainey Myers. I am accompanied by my coworker, Carol Nielsen, as well as the wonderful Alicia Wilson. Just so you are aware, it is 11:20. You are in the Recognizing and Dealing with Vicarious Trauma. Just a really quick description of this. Working in homeless service settings can be exciting, fun, and rewarding. Yet it can also be difficult and sometimes disheartening. People experiencing homelessness include some of the most endearing and interesting people with whom we will ever work. But hearing about, witnessing, and working with their experiences of trauma and injustice can affect even the most positive and strongest among us. We can begin to show signs of vicarious trauma, which is the process of change resulting from empathetic engagement with trauma survivors. This training will focus on how to recognize our own signs of vicarious trauma and ways of dealing with it. Alicia Wilson, she is the clinical director of housing at the Road Home. She has been there for over 20 years, and also her pronouns are she, her, and hers. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and allow Alicia to take over.
Thanks, Lainey. It's good to see you.
You too, for sure.
I hope that we can see each other we can all see each other next year.
Hopefully we can get through this pandemic, huh?
Yeah. All right. So I'll get started. What is vicarious trauma? The definitions for vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and all these things sort of vary depending on the source. So I just kind of picked what made the most sense for our work. It's also most consistent with how SAMHSA defines this stuff. So I'll just define it as vicarious trauma is a component of compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is a type of stress that results from helping or wanting to help those who are traumatized or under significant emotional distress. So basically, that's just any effect that we have from working with our clients. Burnout can be defined in a lot of different ways, and we can be burned out on any job, any lifestyle, any choice that we've made. We can be burned out on anything. But for the purposes of this training, I'm going to define burnout as the physical and mental exhaustion leading to a reduced ability to cope with your environment. Burnout, I'm using burnout as a term for kind of a precursor to vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is basically when we experience similar symptoms to trauma victims as a result of indirect traumatic exposure via close contact with the supervisors. Another definition I found that I thought was really helpful is a negative transformation in the self of a trauma helper. So vicarious trauma tends to be more of an ongoing process of change. Obviously, witnessing or hearing about anything that's really traumatic can affect us, but vicarious trauma, which consists of symptoms that are similar to PTSD, is usually something that's more of a process of it happening over and over again, and we're not taking very good care of ourselves. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So first, let's talk about burnout as a precursor to vicarious trauma. It's kind of good if we're seeing that we have any of these symptoms, because it can be a heads up for us that we have some work to do, some things that we need to do to take care of ourselves. Obviously, difficulty sleeping is really common. And I should mention that some of these things can come from our own life, things going on in our own life, but really, we're the same person, whether we're at work or we're at home. People have talked a lot about work-life balance, but I think that it's kind of misleading because we're not two different people. We're the same person. So everything that happens in our life affects us in our whole life. So if something's going on hard in your life, that can still lead to burnout at work. So difficulty sleeping, obviously exhaustion. I know that we've all felt that. Reduced satisfaction or enjoyment with work. You just sort of feel like you don't enjoy it anymore. Feeling disconnected from your team, friends, and family. An increased use of drugs and or alcohol. And psychosomatic symptoms, such as like a lot of tension, headaches, or digestive issues, or feeling nervous in your body. Psychosomatic means that you're having physical symptoms that aren't directly related to a medical condition. And they're very real. It doesn't mean it's all in your head. They're very real symptoms. But you know, like if you're getting ready to go on a first date and you feel butterflies, it's completely normal. That's actually a psychosomatic symptom. So there's a stigma around it, but it's completely natural and normal for everybody. I wrote, don't panic, because sometimes when people start struggling like this, they kind of panic a little, and we might panic a little and think, oh, I need to get a new job. I'm not cut out for this job, or whatever. Sometimes we get pretty worried that it means something. Everybody goes through periods of burnout. Everybody, it's inevitable. It doesn't mean it's not important and serious to deal with. And, but it's normal. I mean, we're all gonna go through periods where we just feel these symptoms. We need to do something about it, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that there's something fundamentally wrong with you or your life. Okay, so here are some signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma, and note that they're very similar to symptoms of PTSD. A change in worldview and self. This is kind of tough because working in this field, there's no way that we're not going to have a change in worldview, and there's no way that we're not going to change as people. Seeing the things that we see and hearing about the things that we hear, there's no way that we're not going to understand that the world is more unfair and more scary than somebody not working in this field would feel or think. However, if it feels like it's worse than usual, or it feels like maybe you have no hope, which is actually loss of hope is one of them. If it feels like it's serious and not just a natural change in self and based on in reality, it could be something kind of more similar. Feelings of anger or rage, outbursts of anger. I don't know this for sure, but I would say that this is probably the most common symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder that people experience. And I think it's just because you're already on the edge, you know, when you're already having a low bandwidth of frustration tolerance, it's easier to go over the edge. And so if you find yourself raging or really angry at somebody, or angry all the time, it might be something to look at. It could also, I mean, it could be other things too, but it's definitely something to look at. Exaggerated startle response. That is basically if you feel like you're startled a lot more easily than usual. Some of us are startled really easily anyway. Some of us are always in our heads. And so when somebody comes up behind us or something happens behind us, we get startled. But if it feels like it's worse than usual and a kind of a problem, it's something to think about. Difficulty making decisions, confusion, you know, that brain fog. You have a hard time thinking clearly about things, or you keep or a lack of focus is the next one. Like you keep forgetting what you're thinking about, or you keep going in a room and you forget what you're going in for. Some of us do that all the time naturally, but if it's worse, or it's starting to affect your life, it's something to think about. Intrusive thoughts about a client's trauma. This is a really common symptom of PTSD, when somebody just can't stop thinking about the trauma. If we can't stop thinking about things that we've heard, or things that we've seen, or if they just keep coming into your head at times you don't want to be thinking about it. I mean, if you're pondering, you know, your job, yeah, you're gonna think about it. But if it's like just entering into your head without you wanting it to, that can be an intrusive thought, which is a symptom of PTSD and vicarious trauma. And over-identification with trauma survivors. I think this is a definite, I think we're all a little bit at risk for this. If you find yourself having like horror fantasies, you're sort of imagining it happening instead of understanding what happened to the client vaguely, you're starting to think about it in specifics and you kind of can't help it. Or if you start having rescue fantasies, where you kind of fantasize about saving them, that can be a sign that maybe you're over identifying with the survivor and you might have some vicarious trauma going on. Sensing a fundamental and general lack of control. I think working in this field, we all feel that to some extent, but if it feels like it's worse than usual and it's kind of ruining your life a little bit, something to look at. And a loss of hope or foreshortened sense of the future. A foreshortened sense of the future is a really common symptom of PTSD. And sometimes it can be frustrating with working with clients because it seems like they don't think ahead. You know, they might not pay their rent because they don't really think that a week is going to happen, you know, and that can start happening to us if we just have a hard time imagining a future. That can be a symptom of vicarious trauma. And numbing, I mean, obviously using more drugs and alcohol, finding ways to numb your feelings. Yeah. So what causes vicarious trauma? Obviously, empathetic experiences with trauma survivors, that's obvious, but it can be also more than that. Obviously hearing about a trauma survivor's experience of trauma, but also witnessing trauma. The clincher though is where you aren't afraid for your own safety. I remember one time I was outside of 210 and these two women were talking. Oh, sorry, that was the shelter, our old shelter on Rio Grande. That's what we call it, is 210. There were these women that were just talking and it seemed like a pretty regular conversation. And all of a sudden one of them hauled off and just decked the other one. And it was really shocking. And I was really shocked and my heart rate started going faster. And I definitely had a trauma reaction. I wasn't afraid for my own safety, but I definitely had some feelings, you know, some reactions of trauma that are natural. And a lot of us have seen a lot of that kind of stuff. Some of us have seen some really horrible things. And witnessing the aftermath of a trauma, that can be like in a natural disaster or violent encounters. If somebody comes in after they've just been assaulted, you might experience some trauma reactions. And if they were just shortly traumatized and they're still escalated and they're still having those reactions that people tend to have right after, whether it's shock or excitability or whatever, being around somebody who has just been traumatized can definitely be traumatizing for us as well. So there are some risk factors that make us more at risk. And this doesn't mean if any of these risk factors are you, doesn't mean you have to quit your job, just means maybe be a little more diligent about watching your own mental health. Obviously, a personal history of trauma is a risk factor. Hearing about or witnessing someone else's trauma can definitely trigger our own. And I do want to say that we can feel like we've done so much work on our own trauma and feel really emotionally healthy. And we probably are. But that doesn't mean that the survival part of our brain has forgotten what happened. So we can still be triggered by things without it meaning that there's, you haven't done enough work or you're just really unhealthy. Being triggered is a biological process. It's not about who you are. So if you find yourself getting triggered by other people's trauma, you don't have to panic. You just have to, just kind of deal with it. And I'll talk about how to deal with it in a second. But it doesn't mean that you're not healthy enough to do this job. But it does mean that there might be some self-care that you need to do. Pre-existing mood disorders, especially if you're symptomatic. I mean, part of the problem of having a mood disorder is that you're already close to the edge. You know, like I said earlier, you don't have a big enough bandwidth for frustration tolerance. So it just is easier to go over the edge a little bit. If unhealthy coping mechanisms or difficulty expressing emotions, I see this in a lot of men, people who were raised as men and socialized to that expressing emotions is a sign of weakness. This happens a lot, but it can happen to anybody. So we can stuff our feelings, or if we don't know how to cope with our feelings. Being younger in age, that seems pretty obvious. It's obviously harder when you're younger, when you haven't had as many experiences, and having limited professional experiences is definitely going to be harder at first. I think about this all the time because, you know, I've been doing this a really long time, and sometimes I wonder, like, things don't affect me as much as they used to, and sometimes I wonder if I'm a little bit jaded, but I don't think so, because the passion is still there and the compassion is still there. I'm just not shocked by things as much anymore. I see terrible things that happen to people as terrible things that happen to people. I have a dear friend and coworker who likes to say that in this job, you got to be jaded, but in a good way. And I don't know exactly what that means or how to put that into words, but it kind of resonates somehow. We do have to sort of get a thicker skin, and it takes time, and it takes practice having these experiences, and it does get easier the more you have the experiences. Having a lack of life outside of work or hobbies and support networks, obviously that's going to make us more risk. There are some organizational risk factors. If you feel like if you get limited supervision, you don't feel supported by your supervisor, if your caseload is way too high. Now, I want to put a caveat. Of course, your caseload's too high. All of our caseloads are too high. It's sort of a necessary evil of this job. So some of these we can't necessarily fix completely, but it is good to keep an eye on. Geographical and social isolation. You know, if you don't see your coworkers very often, or see other people very often in your job, that can definitely be a risk factor. Working with a lot of traumatized children, working with clients who are underserved and disadvantaged, that would be us. Working for poor pay under stressful conditions with limited resources. I mean, that's by definition us as well. But that doesn't mean that we can't advocate for better resources. And if your agency doesn't acknowledge that vicarious trauma exists and that it's normal, if you kind of get the message from your administration that it means you're weak or maybe not fit for this job, that can definitely make your risk higher. So homeless service providers obviously are at really high risk. A lot of times when people think about vicarious trauma, they think about first responders because they come up on horrible situations. And definitely, they're definitely traumatized by the things that they see. And in some ways, it can be a little harder for us even because we actually know the people and we have close relationships with the people. We oftentimes experience the aftermath with them. We oftentimes try to help, try to hook them up with services to get help. And we know them, and we see their face, and we know who they are, and that can make it really, really hard. Also, all of the injustice and oppression that we face, I think, makes us at extra high risk because dealing with people's trauma is hard enough. And then we have to witness the effects of all the isms or all of the forms of bigotry. We have to witness how policy negatively affects our clients, and sometimes sometimes positively, but it's painful when we see it negatively. We see how they're discriminated against in employment. Oh my goodness, my chair just dropped down. In employment, we see how immigrants are treated. We see how the criminal justice system tends to keep them buried for longer. We see poverty. We see how healthcare can be difficult. And we see how people of color are overrepresented in our population. And when we understand the historical roots to that and the ways that that continues to be perpetuated, it's soul crushing a little bit. So sometimes people will ask me, they'll find out what I do, and then they'll always say, that must be so rewarding. That's what everyone always says. But then they'll say, that must be so hard to see all that suffering. And it is, it 100% is. But in some ways, and I don't say this to anybody, but in some ways, the hardest part is everybody else making our job harder. So I think that definitely puts us at risk. It just gives us a lower ability to handle other people's trauma because we're being bombarded with so much injustice and oppression. All right, so suggestions for preventing and dealing with vicarious trauma. So when I was researching this, the word, self-care stuff all came up. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of tired of the term self-care because every time I hear it, I think, yeah, I should be walking more and doing yoga and eating better. So I'm going to try to come at this from a slightly different perspective. I do have, this is based on research, but I sort of have made it a little different for us. I think arguably the three most important tools besides therapy, go to therapy, that's probably the most important tool. But arguably the three most important tools for preventing and dealing with vicarious trauma are as follows. one, feel your feelings about work at work. That sounds kind of like a no-brainer, but I think that I bet if we were to look at a graph of how much energy we spend feeling our feelings versus how much energy we spend avoiding our feelings, we would probably be shocked. So one of the healthiest things we can do, I mean, just in our lives in general, is experience our feelings about what's happening in as real time as possible. And the ironic thing is we spend so much time avoiding it and so much energy avoiding our feelings when really actually feeling them is usually not as bad as we're afraid it's going to be. And it doesn't tend to take as long as we think it's going to be. It's actually not as hard as it sounds. In fact, even if you just take a few minutes to name what you're feeling, I don't know if any of you have ever heard that phrase, name it to tame it. Even just naming what you feel can be as real time as possible, can be really helpful and therapeutic. Because if we don't name what we feel, it just is like a vague sense of discomfort. And we can't process vague discomfort that we don't even recognize really. So name it. And then if you can, maybe meditate for a few minutes on it, write about it, talk to a coworker about it. It really doesn't have to take a long time. But I heard somebody else, and I wish I could remember his name. He was a trainer. He talked about metabolizing our feelings. And I thought that was such a great analogy. We're going to inhale feelings that are perfectly natural, sometimes uncomfortable, but perfectly unnatural. When everything happens to us, everything that happens to us gives us feelings. And spending the time to metabolize them is a really healthy thing, because then they won't keep coming back up, because they will. I think most of us have figured that out by now. So try to do that in real time as possible. I will say too that sometimes we avoid it, and then we go home and then we think about it and try to deal with it. Well, that's no fun. I mean, live your life. Like if we can just kind of process things as we go, then maybe we'll have a more fun life and spend a lot less energy on frenetically trying to avoid feeling anything. The second thing is measure personal success by something over which you have control. Obviously, our employers have expectations of us, and those are extremely important because that's how we don't get fired and lose our jobs. But think about a way to measure your personal or existential success by something that you have control over. So for example, when I was really young, I was working at the shelter. We were Travelers Aid Society back then. And I was so young, right out of college. And I remember seeing this particular client who was trying to get clean, and then he kept relapsing. He went out into housing at one point and got evicted, and it just kept coming back, and it just felt so hopeless. And I remember thinking, you know, why am I even doing this job? And it occurred to me that I'm doing this job for a lot of reasons, but I'm getting my existential and personal gratification by knowing that every time I encounter that man, I offer him genuine kindness. And that with every encounter I have with somebody, I can leave them just a tiny bit better for having met with me. And that has been I mean, there's a lot of things I've done wrong with self-care over the years, but that is something I did right. And I'm really glad that I did, because it's given me it's given me resilience. Because when we're seeing something super horrible or hearing about something super horrible, it's so easy to feel helpless and powerless. And to be honest, we kind of are in a lot of ways. But if you know that you left that person just a little better off for having encountered you, even just a tiny bit, you can feel pretty good about that and just find that personal gratification in that. And that needs to be whatever works for you. And the third thing is accept reality. This is sort of like people talk a lot about radical acceptance. And I don't know if I really know enough about it to really teach it, but this is sort of like that. Kind of like with feelings. I bet if we were to see a graph of how often we're fighting against reality versus accepting reality, we'd probably be surprised at how much energy we're expending fighting against reality. And we fight against reality by wishing, fantasizing, just as plain escaping. I kind of wish I had understood this concept like 5 years ago, and it would have definitely been, it could have saved me a lot of pain if I had understood this concept as a coping mechanism. Because I think we all spent a lot of time complaining and feeling terrible about things that were happening to our clients. And really, there was nothing we could do about it. I mean, well, that's not true. There are things we can do about it. But what has already happened has happened. And what is right now is right now. And it's totally normal when something seems really unfair or traumatic. It's normal for us to ruminate on that, and our brains try to kind of make sense of it. But sometimes our brains can't make sense of something that's nonsensical. So we spend a lot of energy trying to do mental gymnastics to make ourselves feel better. So I would propose that we accept what is and notice when we're fighting against it. There are caveats. This doesn't mean complacency, or it doesn't mean you approve of what's happening. It doesn't mean that you think it's okay. It's just understanding that what has happened, and what is right now, that is what it is. And then you can choose your next steps from that place of reality. You can problem solve from that place of reality. And the truth might be that our next steps might take years. You know, it might take years for the changes that we want to make to come to fruition. So, but those are our next steps. Embrace your feelings. It doesn't mean that you don't have feelings about what's happening. Right? Again, like in the first topic or the first idea about feeling your feelings, name them and name what this is making you feel like, but without trying to rewrite history. Like when we try to fantasize about it being different to make ourselves feel better, we're just expending so much energy. And if we can consciously accept reality in our prefrontal cortex, make the decision to accept reality, we can save ourselves some energy. And part of the way we can do this is to pretend we accept reality. And this isn't a fake it till you make it kind of thing. And it isn't like you're lying to yourself. What we want to do is we want to get in the habit of accepting reality, even if we can't do it yet very well, because we're really trying to change our brain chemistry. We're trying to create or strengthen a neural pathway that helps us to bypass all of the emotional expenditure that we expend trying to feel better. If we can create a pathway, a neural pathway that helps us to just go to accepting reality a little bit easier, we'll probably be a lot better off. So practice, and the ways you can do that is one way, use coping statements. For example, it is what it is. I can't change what's already happened. I can accept things the way they are. I can only control my own actions and reactions, or whatever works for you. I actually really like it is what it is. I think that using that statement, saying it over and over, even if you're not totally there yet, it's not about lying to yourself. Like I said, it's about creating a neural pathway. It's creating a new habit. And over time, saying those coping statements to yourself, if you're consistent, it does make a difference. Eventually your brain will catch on and decide to follow your agenda. I hope that makes sense. There'll be time at the end if you have any questions. Okay, more suggestions for preventing and dealing with vicarious trauma. Again, I already told you that the term self-care is sort of triggering for me. So I thought of micro acts, or I looked up micro acts of self-care. Sometimes when people tell us to do self-care, they tell us to do things that we do at home. And I think if we can try to do things more often like throughout the day, then we'll be a little bit better off. So drink a glass of water. I mean, if you're thirsty especially, but drink a glass of water. And I'm not talking about hydrating yourself, even though it's great to hydrate yourself. I'm talking about taking that time, like while you're drinking water, it's a little bit hard it's kind of a mindfulness thing for just a second. Use the restroom when you need to. I mean, that seems obvious, but how many of us don't? A lot of us, probably most of us don't. Schedule appointments with sufficient travel time. This is what I'm terrible about. And that's okay. It's okay. We don't have to do every single one of them. We can just pick some, get those as a habit, and then maybe do some more. Take a break from screens. Do a quick meditation. And I mean, it can seriously be like a minute. Or lie on the ground for 30 seconds. I mean, a lot of us don't have floors that we want to lay down on in our offices, but if you do have that, that's cool. Consciously use your breath for a few minutes. That's just listening to your breath. Slow down just a fraction. Make a conscious decision to slow down just a tiny bit. Look up a motivational quote, or call a loved one as you walk or drive to a meeting, and obviously be safe doing that. Read a poem. This is probably my favorite. Look at favorite pictures of family, friends, vacations. I have a great niece who I am so in love with, and all I have to do is look at her pictures. She's 1 year old right now. I just have to look at her pictures and it just changes my whole day. Schedule a personal appointment that you've been putting off. Schedule that mammogram, schedule that colonoscopy. I know those aren't exactly stress relievers, but getting the appointment can definitely take a load off of the stress. And take a 5-minute walk if you can. And then, of course, I do all the stuff like yoga, meditation, nutrition, physical activity, sleep, all that kind of stuff. Definitely do those. But I am not a fan of making you feel guilty for the things you're not doing. So all these other things I talked about, they are possible to do in real time. And then do yoga too, if you want. So here's some suggestions for agencies. Encourage staff members to discuss feelings of how they're being impacted by clients in supervision. I know the Road Home is really doing a great job at that, and we're always working on that. We have case staffings where we talk about how hard it is to work with clients who have been traumatized. Facilitate a separate discussion group about it. Ensure that all staff have knowledge on the impacts of vicarious trauma, provide them training on it upon hire. If somebody doesn't know what's happening, if somebody doesn't know what's going on with them, again, they're going to feel some vague sense of yuckiness. And it's really hard to help a vague sense of yuckiness. So if people can recognize, oh, I'm having this symptom or this symptom or this symptom, or I'm feeling this way, this way, this way, then you can go from there. Then there's something you can do with that. So let them know that this is something that happens. These symptoms happen to us, and to be watching for them. And then be mindful of the number of clients that each staff member takes on. Again, that's caseload. To some extent, that's just the nature of the business. But maybe if you have every single one of your clients is like so traumatized, maybe there's some switching up that people can do, make it a little bit more equitable among workers. Suggestions for supervisors: discuss vicarious trauma as part of supervision. This is kind of important. Model hope and a healthy expression of feelings instead of hopelessness and despair. We want to be real. We don't want to be Pollyanna, but we also, if our staff are seeing that we're despairing, that can definitely create a depressing work environment. If you are a supervisor and you're despairing, talk to your supervisor and other supervisors. You don't necessarily have to let that trickle down to your own folks. Allow for flexible work schedules when that's possible. Recognize the need for staff downtime. Watch for the possibility of withdrawal or isolation if somebody seems like they're more withdrawn or isolated than usual. Create time in a physical space to give staff opportunities for reflection. I know the new headquarters building, the new Road Home headquarters building has a meditation room, which I think is so great. And refer staff to therapy or EAP, and just normalize that there's nothing wrong with you. We all need that sometimes. We can help as coworkers. Probably the most important thing we can do is support a culture of safety where coworkers can express their feelings. I can't stress enough how important a culture of safety is. Making it safe to say the wrong thing or make a mistake and learn from it. Obviously some mistakes are too much to come back from, but most mistakes that we make are just great learning opportunities, and make that safe so that people feel safe to not be perfect. Otherwise, nobody's going to improve. Reach out and talk to your coworkers about how they're doing at work. Support your coworkers in establishing work to home transitions. How often, like in our capitalistic society, we tend to respect the martyr who is the first one to come into work and the last one to leave. Try not to let that be a cultural thing. That shouldn't be a good thing. People who come and work all the hours they're being paid for, that's a good thing. But being that kind of martyr it's not a good thing. We don't need to celebrate that. Encourage your coworkers to do the basics, sleep, healthy eating, hygiene, exercise. If it seems like somebody is just sort of falling apart, talk to them and say, are you getting enough sleep? And maybe, use some, be careful about it. If you don't even know the person, don't say anything, but depending on your type of relationship with the person, you can support them in taking care of themselves. Support your coworkers' connections with family, friends, and coworkers. I think it's really good when coworkers have small talk. Obviously, people have to get their work done, so we have to have boundaries around it. But I think small talk is a really important way to get to know our coworkers and also provide an opportunity to support our coworkers and for them to support us. If it seems like somebody's struggling and they admit they're struggling, offer suggestions for therapy or EAP or something. Let them know that that's a normal thing and we all need that sometimes. And encourage them to talk about their experiences with their supervisor. That's a really great way to support your coworkers, because the culture that you're working in is a great determinant for how happy you're going to be in your job. And if you're basically happy in your job, you're a little less likely to have vicarious trauma. So there is some good news. There is vicarious trauma, but there's also something called vicarious resilience. It's also called vicarious transformation. This refers to the positive effects of this work. Let's not forget the positive effects of this work. We can draw inspiration from a survivor's resilience to strengthen our own mental and emotional fortitude. I am constantly surprised that some of the folks that I work with are still alive, considering the things that happen to them. But they are. Sometimes people die, obviously. But their resilience, I don't know. I'm certain that I could not have those things happen to me at that rate and I would be okay. So the fact that they just keep kicking is inspiring to me. And it can be inspiring to us. Doing this work gives us increased insight, not even just into other people, but into ourselves. If we're doing this work well, we're constantly assessing ourselves. We're being curious about ourselves, which isn't being critical of ourselves. Asking ourselves a lot of questions out of curiosity is really healthy. Being critical of ourselves is not healthy and not helpful and a waste of energy, even though it is more human nature than being curious. But we can, use our human brain or prefrontal cortex to decide to be more curious instead of critical. I think that we can learn so much about each other and ourselves. There's things I would never have learned about myself without having the opportunities I've had in this job. This work can just generally make us better people. I know that's true for me. I think that we tend to just be better people in general. Increased compassion. It is possible to have even more compassion as you learn more about clients and hear their stories. Yeah, there is some resiliency that we want to develop in that we're not shocked and freaked out every time we hear something, but they can still increase our compassion for people in general. And compassion is not something that will wear us out. The more compassion we have, there is compassion fatigue, but like true compassion and true empathy isn't something that will wear us out. It gives us a broader worldview. We know things that happen to people. We know why things are happening to people that most people don't know. It helps us understand what's going on in the world a little better, which admittedly can be kind of depressing. But the next thing I wrote is ignorance is not bliss. I don't think ignorance is bliss. The things that we learn about the world and what happens to people, if we if we become more resilient to them and we actively do our part to make things better, I think that's more blissful, if not more uncomfortable sometimes, than just not even being aware of what's happening. Because not being aware of what's going on in the world is a less well-rounded life. Find the honor in being invited into a world that few people enter into. Sam Severus yesterday said something that really struck me. He said that our folks that living in homelessness or formerly living in homelessness are exiled in plain sight. And that is the perfect description. I think we've all seen what the general public, I mean, when not everybody, a lot of people really care, obviously, and a lot of people are really great support for our work. But you know, when you're walking down the street with one of your clients, you can kind of see people's eyes kind of look away, or sometimes they look at you like, why are you with that person? Just you know, and then it's not all, you know, it's not, it doesn't mean they're like terrible judgmental people. It's just that that we're being invited into a world that most people aren't invited into, and we should see that as an honor and a responsibility. It is a different world that our clients live in. We don't want them to be living in that world. We want to help them move back into the community, but until they do, they are living in a world that is theirs, and if they invite us into it, we should take that as a serious responsibility, I think. And then lastly, sometimes when things seem super awful, I remind myself, hey, at least we're doing something. I mean, not very many people are doing anything, so at least we're doing something. And I think we can find some comfort in doing something that not a lot of people even want to be doing. This went a lot faster than I thought it would. Here are some resources. There's some tests you can take and things. There's surprisingly little information. There's a lot of data that proves that vicarious trauma is a real thing, but how to cope with it is I don't know that there's a ton. I couldn't really find a lot of evidence-based or peer-reviewed papers on exactly what we can do to avoid or deal with vicarious trauma. But here are some resources. And that's actually what I've got. Went a little bit faster than I thought it would. Maybe I'm a fast talker. Maybe that's it. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything that you think I might have missed? Because this is an imperfect science. I'd love to hear other ideas.
If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A box, or go ahead and raise your hand. I can certainly unmute you. Let me know.
Or something works for you.
I will say I previously worked for the Road Home many years ago, and I worked personally with Alicia, and you know, some of the things that she presented today definitely took me back to the support that Alicia provided, and I was really grateful for that. And
so it wasn't you weren't being triggered.
Oh no, of course not. I mean, I definitely understand it's hard work, and it's grueling, and you do experience that vicarious trauma and that secondhand trauma. And my team, we met with Alicia once a week, and it was just so great to be able to express ourselves and have a judgment-free area and to get advice. And I definitely feel that you were really just had a great compassion for the work and us, as well as, you know, the people that we were serving. And it definitely went a long way for sure.
Thank you, Lainey.
Betcha. Thank you. Looks like we do have a couple questions.
Okay.
Let's see. I'd love to hear how other agencies have implemented the debriefing sessions with staff and supervisors. When do you do those, and how is it working?
Well, I don't know about other agencies.
Right. Carol Nielsen says that she would like to answer this question. Carol's my
Wonderful.
Oh, no, I just put that it's being answered live. So.
Oh, gotcha.
Instead of, because there's just to let everyone know, so there's an option to type in the answer or for it to be answered live. So,
Perfect.
Alicia,
Okay.
would you like to speak to what you all do?
Well, as far as debriefing, my understanding on the research about specific debriefing techniques, my understanding is that the data is a little varied. Some research shows that doing too much debriefing right at first isn't very helpful. Some shows that debriefing later is more helpful. So I would say that at the road home, our supervisors tend to be super good about watching for these kind of things. At least the supervisors that I work with one-on-one. And so I think it kind of depends on the person. I mean, if somebody comes back from something traumatic and says, you know, I will want to talk about it, but I don't want to talk about it right this second. I'm still processing it in my own mind a little. Obviously, we're going to respect that. So I think it's kind of, I don't know that there's like one, I know that there are debriefing protocols out there, but the research on whether they work well or not, and depending on the type of situation, like there might be, there's protocols for if there's a natural disaster, but if you're coming, you know, if you just heard a terrible story from somebody, I don't know that there's like one protocol that works for everybody. So I think you just play it by ear. I think the most important thing is to make it okay that it's happening, and make the feelings okay and the experience okay, and respect what the person is saying. If they come in and they just start talking about it a lot, that's great, and listen to it. But there is something that happens. When we start rambling and when we start venting. Like venting can be good, but it can also be kind of not good, because when we vent and we just kind of keep saying the same thing over and over again, sometimes it solidifies those neural pathways that of anxiety. It's more anxiety provoking. It's why we don't really have people do punching when they're angry anymore, because it tends to increase overall aggression levels. So, you know, you kind of want to be careful that they're not just sort of spinning out. If they're spinning out, you might want to do something that's more grounding, like, hey, let's do some meditation before we keep talking about this. So it's imperfect science. 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. And I think that supervisors and agencies can keep learning as they go from each individual person's own experience. That's all.
It's really great, Alicia. Thank you. We do have another question. Is there any affordable resources for therapy for people working in this field? The EAP option is good, but some of us, like therapists, we can develop long-term relationships with.
So people always ask me about therapy outside of the nonprofit sector, and I have to be honest, I don't know what people are doing outside of the nonprofit sector. I don't know of anything. I think that if hopefully you have health insurance, and there's, you can, you know, look at what your health insurance will cover. But yeah, I'm not great about that. I mean, you could try to find someone who's willing to work on a sliding scale fee. And there are agencies out there that work on sliding scale fees, but I'm really not that knowledgeable about that. So if anybody knows of any, definitely type it in and help each other.
I have heard of the EAP programs as they are great, but definitely more short-term, but they can recommend more long-term advice for individuals seeking for long-term assistance.
Yeah.
Another question, Let's see, any advice for not having enough hours in my work week to get everything done and feeling guilty for going home and getting the rest I need?
Oh my goodness. Carol, do you want to answer that?
No, I was just.
Oh, you were just doing the same thing. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
just indicating that it's being answered live. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So we only have like 4 minutes, and I could talk about this for an hour. And you're welcome to email me too. My email is awilson@theroadhome.org, and maybe I can we can start a dialogue a little bit. But I think that thinking of your day, one thing that I have found kind of helps is thinking of your day as broken up into hours. And each hour, make the decision what would be the best use of your time in this hour. And then just keep doing that throughout the day. And then, I don't know it's hard to not feel guilty. There's not secrets for how to not feel guilty. I mean, it's human nature to feel guilty. One thing is recognizing feeling guilty in some ways is a way to sort of make ourselves feel better for not getting everything done. It's almost like if I feel guilty, then it makes up for the fact that that I didn't get everything done. I mean, if you didn't get everything done, but you can say that you used each hour in the best way possible, then that might be a time you choose to accept reality. I mean, feeling guilty about something is almost, it's kind of self-serving in a way, because it's like, if I beat myself up enough, then that will make up for the fact that I didn't get everything done. Well, of course you didn't get everything done. Nobody gets everything done. Nobody in this field gets everything done every single day. And that is the reality. So try to accept that, use the skill of accepting reality and recognizing that feeling guilty is a waste of energy that is also a little bit self-serving in a way. Like beating ourselves up is a little bit self-serving. And there's so much more to that. There's so many layers to that. So I'm sorry, I'm just saying that and then not being able to say anything more about it because I'm running out of time.
Really quickly, I did see in the chat someone suggested Jewish Family Services.
Good.
They are a great community resource. Also for me, something I've had a lot of good success in helping people with is Psychology Today is a great website in really helping you search locally and really filter options by price, by insurance. If you're looking at a certain modality, especially for like trauma and things like that. So it's a pretty good resource that gives you filtered options to really dig in and see what therapists are available.
That's great. Well, we're almost out of time. Feel free to email me again, awilson@theroadhome.org. I make no promises as to how fast I will get back to you, but I will get back to you as soon as possible.
There's been many comments in the question, the Q&A, just saying this has been a great session.
Thank you.
I full-heartedly agree.
Thank you.
We're at 1 minute to go. If there's no more questions, we can certainly give you a minute back. I have 11 minutes until your next session, or we have a lunch break.
Yeah, lunch.
Yay! Enjoy your lunch and
eat your lunch. Go eat your lunch. That's a good self-care thing.
Don't eat your lunch away from your desk. I always try to do that. Sure.
That is a great thing to do. And if it's absolutely impossible, at least try to taste your lunch.
Yes, mindfully eat it.
Yeah.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Alicia. This has really been a great session, and I appreciate everybody's participation and good questions and comments for sure.
Yeah, thank
again,
you.
Alicia A. Wilson at theroadhome.org. If you have any questions. Thank you again for your time, and thank you everyone for your time as well. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.